I was not born with thunder, nor did I arrive with the blaze of noon. I came quietly, almost imperceptibly, slipping over the crest of the hill, as I had done since the first morning the world began. But that morning, yes, that one was different. I, a beam of light, long accustomed to brushing stones and warming dew, felt something tremble deep within the land as I touched the old mountain. That mountain had stood for ages, its ridges cut by wind and time, its silence soaked with the footsteps of prophets who once dared speak for God. I knew their paths, the places where they wept, where they shouted, where they fell silent. I had lit their faces in the glow of courage and despair, and yet, never had I felt them so close as I did that morning, when my warmth met their dust once again. The stones beneath me shimmered as they always had, but there was a gleam in them, not of my doing. It was as if they recalled the echoes of Isaiah's cries, the trembling of Elijah's whispers, the thunder in Jeremiah's lament. Those voices once carved through the air like chisels, shaping a people's yearning for a promise they could not yet see. I was there then too, dancing among their words, though they did not see me. I was a witness, not the message. But that morning, I felt myself become more than the reflection of a rising star. I became part of a gaze turning toward fulfillment. The sky above me remained pale, waiting, stretched like a canvas unsure of the first stroke. And then, as I poured down over the eastern slope, I met silence. Not emptiness, but a living silence, like a hush that falls in a temple when something sacred enters the room. My rays touched dry grass, rough bark, forgotten altars. Each responded not with sound, but with a kind of attention, as though the earth itself were listening. And I listened too, for I, who traveled the sky endlessly, knew when something beyond time began to draw breath. I turned my face westward, brushing the edge of a village still sleeping under clay roofs and linen curtains. I knew that place, Nazareth. I had warmed its mornings for years, watched children chase shadows and mothers hang laundry in the breeze. But never had I felt what I felt that morning. As I touched the edge of a windowsill, light slipping between the cracks of old wood, something stirred not just in the room, but in me. There was a woman there, awake before the cock crowed, her hands folded not in work but in waiting. She did not know I watched, but I did, and more than watched, I felt drawn, I lingered. For though I was bound to move, to stretch and rise and fade with the sun's climb, something in me wanted to stay, to witness, to be part of this moment, whatever it was becoming. I had seen kings crowned and temples built. I had lit battles and bathed graves, but never had I seen such stillness in a living being, such surrender without knowing what would come. It was as if she were waiting not for a sign, but for a whisper. And though no angel had yet spoken, the air around her hummed with possibility. And I, the light of 1,000 dawns, knew I was not the beginning this time. I was the herald. She did not speak. She did not move. But her breath had a rhythm that matched the hush of the land, as though creation itself were inhaling with her, holding its breath for what might come next. I slid across the stone floor, over pottery cracked by time, over a woven mat worn by years of prayer. I had passed through temples and markets, over scrolls and swords, but never had I seen a place so empty of noise, yet full of presence. The kind of fullness that makes light lean in to listen. Outside, the first birds had not yet sung, and the dew clung stubbornly to every blade of grass. I kissed each drop as gently as I could, not wanting to disturb the fragile stillness. I had learned over millennia that revelation does not always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it enters like this, unseen, unsought, but utterly undeniable. That morning I knew what it meant to witness the beginning of something not yet spoken. I, the first shimmer on the face of the deep, the child of let there be light, recognized a tremor in the order of things, not chaos, but a turning toward fulfillment, toward incarnation. And it began not with fire or trumpet, but with one woman kneeling alone in the hush before dawn, her heart like fertile soil long watered by tears and waiting. I was the first to see her that day, and somehow, I knew I was not just bringing light, I was being sent ahead of the word. I rose higher, reluctantly, called by the rhythm of time, but something in me remained, something that had touched the eternal in her silence, in her yes that had not yet been said but was already being prepared in the stillness of her soul. I would return, I would blaze more brightly, cast shadows that would dance with angels, flood the world with the gold of revelation. But I would never forget that moment, that breath, that hush on the hill before all things began again. Even now, as I move across skies and centuries, that dawn remains within me, and every time I touch another morning, I wonder, who is waiting now? Who is listening? Who is ready for the light before the word? I have always returned to this mountain. Long before that morning in Nazareth, long before her silent prayer, I had poured myself over these ridges and ravines, tracing the paths where feet once carried fire. I remember them, not just their names, but their steps, their sighs, their solitude. Prophets, they were called. But to me, they were echoes made flesh, voices wrapped in frailty. They came not for glory, not for applause, but because something greater than themselves burned in their bones. I remember how they walked, slow sometimes, swift at others, always with a tension in their gait, as if carrying a word too large for the human tongue. They did not all speak alike. Some roared like lions, shaking kingdoms with words that split stone and silenced kings. Others wept as they spoke, their tears etching channels in the dust, their voices hoarse from pleading with hearts that would not bend. And some, like Amos and Micah, came from the soil itself, barefoot and unlearned, yet full of truth that no temple gate could contain. I saw them climb this mountain in the pale blue hush before crowds arrived, rehearsing nothing, carrying only their burning questions and their terrifying certainty. Once, I found myself lying long upon the shoulders of Elijah as he stood at the edge of a cave, listening not to wind or fire or earthquake, but to the still small voice that came after. It was not me he saw that day. I was only the light that danced on the cave wall, but he knew, as I did, that something holy had passed by. He wrapped his cloak around his face, and I warmed the fold of that fabric, feeling the tremor of awe rise in him like dawn over the valley. And later, when he ran, outrunning chariots and thunderclouds, I followed him like breath itself, unseen yet essential. I have touched the scrolls of Isaiah before they were read aloud, felt the ink still drying under sun-warmed hands. I remember the day he walked this very ridge, stopping to watch shepherds guide their flocks along ancient paths. "A child," he whispered, as if the thought had slipped through a seam in eternity, "will be born for us." And I, hovering on his brow, knew he did not fully understand what he had seen, but he believed it nonetheless. And so did I. Jeremiah, too, came this way, shoulders hunched, bowed by the weight of visions he could not escape. His eyes were too open, his heart too raw. I followed him like a faithful shadow, streaming across his path as he wept for a city that would not hear, for a temple that would fall. He did not speak with ease. His mouth tasted of ashes and iron. His tongue sometimes refused to move, and yet when he spoke, the very wind seemed to hold its breath. I watched as he crumbled to his knees in the silence between sentences, whispering prayers no one else would hear. I caught those prayers. I carried them skyward. And then there was Malachi, the last of them before the long silence fell. He was not loud, nor was he broken like Jeremiah. His voice was lean, carved from years of waiting. Yet his words carried a strange weight. "The Son of Righteousness," he said once, standing in the golden hour just before I disappeared beyond the western hills, "shall rise with healing in its wings." I remember pausing then, hovering over his shoulder, wondering if he spoke of me or of something yet to come. Healing wings, what a phrase, what a promise. But after him, no one came, not for a long time. The mountain grew quiet. I still returned, faithfully, every dawn. I spilled over the same ridges, warmed the same stones, but the silence was different now. It wasn't the expectant hush of listening. It was the weary quiet of forgetting. People still climbed the paths, but they no longer listened to echoes. They no longer asked what the rocks remembered. They looked for herbs, for goats, for solitude, but not for revelation. And so I kept shining, even as the stories beneath the soil waited for breath. Still, the mountain itself did not forget. It held memory like a seed holds spring, like a scroll waits for the hand that will unroll it. When I brushed its surface, I felt the pulse beneath its skin, the stories it refused to release. And in that tension, I found my own longing awakening. Light is not meant to remember. I am born each day and die each night, forever beginning again. But I remembered every prophet, every cry, every unanswered prayer that rose from this mountain like incense seeking fire. So when that morning came, the one when I slipped through a Nazareth window and found her already awake, already listening, I knew what had led to her. I knew she was not a beginning, but a culmination. She was the echo of every echo, the answer forming in the silence left by centuries of pleading. And I, who had danced on the shoulders of prophets and warmed the pages of their words, was now a witness to the word preparing to take on flesh. And so I lingered longer on that mountain that day. I did not rush as I once had. I moved slowly, deliberately, pressing myself into the cracks of the stones, tracing the edges of paths once made holy by bare feet and burning hearts. The mountain breathed beneath me, not with lungs, but with memory, and I breathed with it. If light could weep, I might have wept then not from sorrow, but from reverence. The prophets had not failed. Their words had not vanished. They had prepared the way, each syllable like a torch, passed from hand to trembling hand across the generations. And now, in the quiet warmth of dawn, I saw what they had only glimpsed, a threshold being approached, a door unlocking from within. I was not the door. I was merely the light that revealed its frame. But that was enough. That was everything. I continued to rise, inch by inch across the ancient mountain, but the warmth I carried could not chase away the heaviness that lingered in the air. It was not the chill of night, nor the weight of weather, but something deeper, a silence that had grown thick through generations, a darkness not of absence but of delay. I had seen such silences before. I had hovered over Egypt before the plagues, over Babylon before the tears, over Rome before the blood. But this was different. This silence had settled like dust on forgotten altars, like cobwebs in corners once filled with song. It was not angry, it was not cold, it was simply long. And in that length, it had become a kind of lullaby, numbing the hearts that once burned for more. For centuries I had bathed the temples and the synagogues, brushed across scrolls rolled tight and untouched, watched dust gather not only on pages but on hearts. The words remained, but the hearing faded. The rituals endured, but the wonder thinned. And as I stretched myself across fields and rooftops, over wells and doorposts, I saw eyes that still blinked against my brightness, yet did not look up. I was noticed, yes, but no longer received. Like a letter unopened, I passed across faces unmoved by glory, by mystery, by hope. And still I came, day after day, because light does not cease to be light when it is ignored. Even the mountain seemed subdued, not forgetful, no, it remembered too well, but its memory brought more ache than hope. I could feel it in the groan of the stones beneath my warmth, in the way the shadows clung just a little longer to the crevices, reluctant to retreat. This was not resistance to mate, was resistance to disappointment. So many promises, so many dawns that came and went. How long can one wait before the waiting becomes its own kind of burden? I had no answer, though I had watched generations rise and fall, watched faithful ones bury their hopes in soil too dry to yield. Yet even as I moved across this familiar ridge, something in me resisted despair. There was a quiver, a thin vibration beneath the stillness, not loud enough to be called sound, but not silent either. I could not name it. It was not joy. It was not sorrow. It was like the hush before a voice speaks your name, like the air just before a curtain is drawn back. I leaned into it, spreading wider across the earth as if to catch whatever it was becoming. I reached into valleys, into corners where night still held dominion. I touched rooftops yet unlit, doorways still closed, paths where no feet stirred. I was not yet seen, I was not yet welcome, and yet I came. That is my nature. I arrive before I am expected. I appear before I am understood. And in that arrival, I declare only one thing: the darkness has an end. Even if the heart cannot yet feel it, even if the eyes are still closed against the brightness, Even if the soul prefers the familiarity of shadow to the risk of light, I come, because that is what hope does. It shows up, quietly, persistently. There were those who still remembered. An old man by the gate, his eyes dim with age but not with hope, rose each morning before the bells, wrapped in his cloak and prayer. He stood in silence as I kissed his hands. He did not speak, he did not need to. His very posture was a psalm. There was a woman too, bent and quiet, who whispered the names of the prophets as she ground the grain for bread, each syllable a petition. And a child, not yet touched by the cynicism of delay, chased shadows in the courtyard and paused, just once, to look up and smile as I caught his face. I saw them, I warmed them, and I carried their longing across the hill, letting it mingle with mine. For I too had begun to long, not just to shine, not just to rise, but to reveal, to illuminate something worth beholding again. I am not eternal, I am fleeting. Yet that morning, I felt the stirrings of eternity within me, not because of anything I had done, but because of what was coming. It was not here yet, not fully, but it approached like the tide, slow but unstoppable. I could not see its face, I could not trace its shadow, but the mountain knew, the silence knew. Even the birds, usually first to greet me, remained still, as if unwilling to interrupt the arrival of something sacred. And so I continued, not just to rise, but to watch, to wait. I poured myself over the temple stones, over empty streets, over market stalls yet untouched by noise. I reached the edge of the village and paused, not for rest I do not tire but for reverence, because somewhere beyond the horizon, beyond the veil of time, something holy stirred. I had seen dawns for 1,000 lifetimes, had lit faces both cruel and kind, had shimmered on altars and on swords. But this dawn was different. It felt aimed, directed, as though the entire sky had bent its arc for this one morning. I did not understand, but I obeyed. I leaned into my calling, not just to shine, but to witness. And though I had no voice, I found myself longing to speak, to say, "Stay awake, stay open. Do not let this silence fool you. It is not the silence of absence. It is the silence before music. It is not the stillness of death, but of life about to bloom." And so I did what only light can do. I continued, not with certainty, but with devotion. Not with clarity, but with faith. I swept across the hill one more time, casting gold upon stone, calling not with sound but with presence. And in the hush, in the almost of that morning, I waited for the word to breathe, for the silence to break, for the shadow to step aside. I did not know how close it was. I only knew I must be there when it arrived, long before the village stirred, before the first shutter creaked open, or the first rooster broke the hush. I slipped across a rooftop and found them those who waited not with words, but with hearts carved by silence. They did not shout their longing. They did not write their names in stone. They were like coals hidden under ash, warm though unseen, glowing though windless. I found them in corners, in thresholds, in the narrow spaces between sorrow and ritual. They were the ones who still rose before dawn without being told, who lit lamps not just for the house, but for the heart, who whispered names only heaven could hear. Their names are forgotten by most, not recorded in scrolls or sung in psalms. But I knew them. I had warmed their faces through winters of doubt and summers of drought. I had seen their lips move in the dark, mouthing prayers too fragile to be spoken aloud. There was one, a widow who lived at the edge of the town, whose every breath was a whispered plea. She had buried both husband and son, and now each morning she lit a small oil lamp and watched it flicker in the cold. She said nothing, but the way her fingers trembled when she folded them spoke louder than lament. I passed over a shepherd who had not yet left his home, sitting by the door with sandals untied, staring into the remnants of a dream he could not remember but could not forget. His fingers worked the edge of his cloak, and his mouth moved with the old words, the ones his father taught him, the ones that spoke of deliverance, of one who would come and gather the lost. He did not know if he still believed, but he said them anyway. And I touched his shoulder, not to answer, but to affirm, to be there, because light, when it is true, does not abandon longing. There was also an old priest, no longer serving in the temple, whose voice had grown too quiet for the crowds. He sat alone each morning in a stone alcove, robe faded, hands gnarled, eyes cataracted by time, and yet he listened, not for footsteps or thunder, but for something softer, the sound of God breathing. And though his ears could barely catch the wind, his heart caught the weight of things. He did not pray aloud, but I saw the way his fingers traced invisible letters on his knee, as if writing scripture not to be read but remembered. His silence was thick with echoes, as if every unspoken word still hung in the air around him, waiting for fulfillment. I lingered near him longer than I meant to. There was something about his waiting that mirrored my own. He had no promise left but presence, no answer left but attention. And I, too, was watching the horizon, not for signs but for stillness breaking. These were not the loud ones, not the bold proclaimers or the fervent dreamers. These were the remnant, the few who had not let the silence convince them that God had gone. They carried hope like embers, hidden under cloaks of ordinariness. I saw one in the market, a young woman carrying water, her stride heavy but her eyes scanning the sky. I saw another in a workshop, humming a psalm between hammer strikes. I saw a boy beside a fig tree, carving names into wood, his fathers, his grandfathers, and leaving a space blank. They did not speak of the Messiah over meals. They did not fast with show or offer loud alms, but in them, something pulsed, an ache that had not gone numb, a hunger that had not dulled. And I, the light of morning, felt strangely small before them. I had seen emperors bow to golden idols, had shone on palaces that outlived their king. But here, in these silent waiters, I saw something unshakable. Not power, but promise. Not clarity, but commitment. They did not need certainty to believe. They needed only space, and that was what they gave attention. Not the kind that scans for miracles, but the kind that holds space for mystery. That morning, as I poured myself across their paths, I realized I was not alone in waiting. I was not the only witness to the turning. They had kept watch through the long night, not with eyes but with fidelity. Their lives had become candles, flickering still, even when the wind was cruel and the oil ran low. I did not make them burn, I only revealed their fire. And in their dim light I felt a strange humility. For though I traveled farther than any creature, though I touched mountaintops and oceans in the same hour, I could not kindle what they kept alive. Their waiting was not passive. It was defiant. It was a song with no melody, a prayer with no response, a faith that refused to retire. And I, who had thought myself the herald of dawn, found myself instead its student. I traced their shadows not to lead, but to learn. So I pressed into the cracks of their homes, spilled gently over the beds where children still slept, slipped across thresholds worn by repetition. And in that quiet, I heard a question not from them, but from within me. Was this how God would come? Through quiet? Through waiting? Through people the world did not notice, and whose names would not be remembered. I had lit temples and thrones and battlefields, but now I wondered if the throne of heaven would descend not upon a mountain, but into a room still dark, into hearts still aching, into prayers whispered not with triumph but with trembling. I knew I could not answer. I was light, not knowledge, but I could bear witness. I could shine on their devotion, so that when the word did come, it would not find the world entirely asleep. It would find these hearts already turned, already burning. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was why I was sent ahead, not to awaken the sleepers, but to honor the watchers, to touch them gently and say, "Yes, you are not alone. Something is near. Keep watch." As I climbed higher over the mountain and the village below began to stir in whispers, I felt the air shift around me, not as resistance but as welcome. The wind, that old companion who roams without path or permission, met me at the ridge with a sigh. We have long traveled side by side, me shaping shadows, it carrying sound. But that morning, it did not race past me nor swirl playfully. It paused, hovered, as if to ask, "Do you feel it too?" I did not answer, for I have no mouth, but I leaned into it, wrapping my warmth around its breath, and we moved together, not quickly, not like a storm, but slowly like reverence. Together we swept across the valley, dipping into ravines and brushing the brows of hills like gentle hands upon sleeping faces. The dew clung to every surface, glistening where I touched it, trembling where the wind passed. It had not yet surrendered to warmth, and in its shimmer I saw destiny, speechless signs of nights endured. Dew does not speak. It appears, it disappears. It leaves no trace but memory. Yet that morning it stayed longer than usual, as if reluctant to release its vigil, and I, for once, did not hasten its retreat. There was something reverent in the way creation held its breath. The trees did not rustle. The birds, usually jubilant at my coming, remained hidden. Even the insects, tireless in their song, offered pause. The whole world seemed to bow not in fear, but in awareness. Something was shifting, and we light, wind, dew were the first to notice. We are the oldest of witnesses. We were there when rivers carved their beds, when stars first blinked into the dark. Yet even we felt young that morning, like guests rather than hosts, like servants preparing a table we ourselves did not understand. I lingered where the wind curled around a fig tree, old and twisted, its roots gripping the soil like hands in prayer. The dew clung to its leaves, and I traced their edges with soft gold. The wind circled once, twice, and then slipped upward, dancing with me along the trunk, between the branches, into the open sky. Soon, it seemed to whisper, soon. And I believed it not because the wind knows all, but because it listens. It listens to things no ear can catch, to rhythms buried beneath noise. And so I followed it, the two of us weaving across the hillside, speaking not in words but in presence. Where I shone, it stirred. Where it passed, I glowed. And the dew, though voiceless, caught our motion and shimmered with quiet praise. We were not creators, we were not messengers, but we were participants. And that morning, participation felt like prayer, the kind that does not ask but abides, the kind that does not demand but dwells. We moved together over a stream that barely murmured, its surface glassy, its depths still dark. The wind skimmed its top like fingers across a harp, and I sent rays deep enough to touch pebbles unseen. In the ripples, a reflection formed not of sky or cloud, but of longing, the kind only nature holds, unspoken but unceasing. For even the trees stretch upward, even the rocks wait for voice, and we, who move without resting, recognize that ache in everything we touched. It was the ache of anticipation. We found a cave where shepherds sometimes slept, empty now but not abandoned. The dew had gathered in the stone grooves like tears on cheeks, and the wind moved gently through the entrance as though exhaling a blessing. I entered not as a blaze but a hush, lighting the corners where shadows huddled. It was a small space, unadorned, but it received us like sanctuary. There are places on earth that remember what heaven sounds like. This was one, and though no song rose, we heard it. The silence hummed with expectancy. I moved on, not because I wanted to leave, but because light cannot stay. I must continue. I must stretch, unfold, reach the unseen. But that morning, I felt reluctant. There was something sacred about the pause. The way the wind slowed, the way the dew lingered, as though all creation was holding its breath. And I, the herald of day, was not simply beginning another dawn, but preparing to illuminate the threshold of eternity. I do not know how I knew. I only know that I did. So I rose further, slowly, brushing rooftops and thresholds and faces not yet woken. I met windows still closed, curtains unmoved, yet even there I left a touch, a promise. The wind danced beside me, less as breeze now and more as breath. And the dew, where not yet dried, glowed as if lit from within. We had no plan, no prophecy, no timeline, but we had fidelity. We were here, we had come, and that was enough. As I reached the highest point of the hill, I turned one last time toward the quiet places we had passed. Nothing grand had occurred, no trumpet, no lightning, but everything had changed. Because in the pause, in the hush, in the shared awareness of creation itself, something had been exchanged. Not news, but nearness. Not proof, but presence. And in that presence, I realized, hope does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers through wind, clings in dew, rests in light. And together we waited not for the signs in the sky, but for the stirring in the soul. Because even before the word is spoken, the world knows. Even before the first cry is heard, the heart prepares room. And wheelite, wind, dew had seen enough to know something holy was on its way. I turned gently from the hills and descended toward the edge of Nazareth, not in haste, but with the quiet resolve of one summoned. The houses were still draped in early shadows, shutters closed, pathways empty. I moved like a breath, barely noticed, brushing the ground, climbing walls, stretching toward the small house where she slept. I did not know her name, not yet, but something in the very dust near her door shimmered with a stillness unlike any other. I had touched palaces gilded with pride and walked the golden halls of high priests, but I had never felt what I felt here: anticipation wrapped in peace, humility pulsing with strength. Inside, the room was spare. The scent of olive wood and worn linen lingered in the corners. A clay jug stood by the window, half filled. A loom rested against the wall, threads paused mid-weave, and she was there, not sleeping, but sitting already awake, though the world was not. Her hands rested in her lap. Her gaze, though still, was not empty. It reached beyond the room, beyond mourning, beyond understanding. I had illuminated the faces of queens, the councils of priests, the ink of scribes, but I had never lit a face like this. It did not shine back at me. It received. It welcomed without condition. It was not beauty that caught me, 'twas consent, offered before the asking. I did not flood the room with gold. I entered slowly, tenderly, as one might approach sacred ground. I traced the floor first, finding the path her feet had worn smooth with repetition: morning prayers, evening silences, tasks done not out of duty, but from devotion. I rose along the wall, touched the folds of her shawl, kissed the quiet curve of her cheek. She did not move, but she knew. There was a shift in the air, a breath drawn not from lungs but from eternity. She did not turn her head. She did not need to. Presence has weight, and she bore it with grace. She was young, but not empty. Her youth held something ancient, a memory planted before time. Her soul was not waiting to be filled, it had been listening all along. Listening not to voices around her, but to the echo of something older than words. I had seen such listening before, in caves and deserts, in the silence after prophets stopped speaking, but never like this, never so still, never so whole. I hovered near the table where a crust of bread sat beside a folded cloth. She had eaten simply. She had not prepared for anyone, and yet the table felt set. The room, though small, held a largeness that did not come from space but from presence. I moved to the window, the source of my entry, and bathed its frame in light. Dust danced like tiny witnesses, spiraling between us. She blinked, slowly, not from sleep but from recognition. Something had arrived, not fully seen, not yet spoken but real. I did not yet understand the fullness of my role. I was not the voice. I was not the word. I was only the first breath before speech. The moment stretched, not in slowness, but in depth. Time did not rush here. It opened, as if all of creation had paused, not held still, but held open, waiting for one note to be sung that would draw heaven into earth. I had lit scrolls in the synagogues of Jerusalem, traced golden lines across temple floors, pierced the shadows of holy places. But this house, this room, this solet was sanctuary, not by architecture, by attention. She was attending to something beyond herself. Her heart had cleared room not by pushing things away, but by receiving everything as gift. She stood then, not abruptly, not ceremonially. She simply rose, as one rises when they hear their name before it is spoken. Her steps were quiet, but they carried gravity. She moved to the window and placed her hands on the sill, where I was brightest. Her fingers passed through me, not disturbing my form, but receiving it. And in that gesture, something passed between me, the first light of morning, and she, the first heart of a new covenant. I did not speak, but she understood. Her breath caught, not in surprise, but in surrender. There was no vision yet, no angel, no announcement, but the room had already become a threshold. The veil between seen and unseen had thinned, and I was its witness. I did not cause this. I did not call her. But I had the unspeakable privilege to be present, to touch the air before it became voice, to bathe the walls that would soon echo with eternity. She remained by the window, eyes closed now, as if listening for a word not yet uttered. I lingered there, pouring myself around her shoulders, her hands, her brow. She did not speak, and I did not need her to. Her silence was fuller than song. It was assent before the question, openness before the offering. I moved no further. I had reached my place. This was not a light to pass through. This was light come home. Outside, the village had begun to wake. A door creaked. A child cried. The day unfolded. But within this room, time held its breath. I knew the angel was near. I felt the fabric of reality tremble slightly, not with fear but with nearness. And I remained unmoving, unflinching, not as observer but as participant. For though I could not speak, I had become part of the message, its words, but its warmth. And in that moment, I understood something I never had before, that even light, made to move, can be still when stillness becomes holy. That morning, I did not shine to declare. I shone to prepare. And in that quiet preparation, the world began to turn. The moment before he came was not marked by thunder or brilliance. There was no rushing wind, no trembling earth. The room remained as it was still, ordinary, soaked in morning light. But something shifted, something I, who have touched countless dawns, had never felt. It was not arrival, it was unveiling. A curtain between worlds parted, not with sound, but with awareness. I did not move. I dimmed, though not from weakness, but from reverence. My role was to illuminate, not to compete. I pulled back toward the edges of the room and let stillness take center. He did not enter through the window or the door. He was simply there, as if he had always been there, waiting for the veil to thin. His presence was not weight but focus, not pressure but density, the kind of gravity that draws not the body but the soul. Gabriel. I had seen him before, from afar. Once, when he visited the prophet Daniel. Once, when he stood silent above the altar. He had not changed, and yet he had never looked more like light wrapped in will. He bore no weapon, he carried no scroll, he needed neither. His face was calm, but not cold. His wings were not spread, they were stilled. He came not to warn, he came to invite. She did not startle, she did not fall. Her eyes widened, yes, but not from fear, from recognition. As if her soul had heard this voice before time began, he did not raise his arms, he did not tower. He simply bowed not in deference, but in alignment. Heaven had come to speak, and he came as its breath. "Hail, full of grace," he said, and the words were not just sound but substance. They filled the room, they filled me. I trembled, though I am light and know no fear, because in that moment I saw it. The infinite was drawing near to the finite, not to overwhelm it, but to dwell within it. She did not answer right away. Silence stretched again, but not in uncertainty. In absorption, she weighed his words the way one holds a newborn, carefully, entirely. I remember how she tilted her head, not in confusion, but in listening. The angel waited. Heaven does not rush when eternity leans close, and I watched. I had never seen words do what these did. They did not just inform, they invited, not as command, as covenant. Her eyes lowered, not in shame, but in sheltering something just received. The air between them thickened with holiness. Even I, for all my journeys across creation, had never stood so close to the breath of God touching human soul. She asked then not from doubt, but from discernment. Her voice was softer than the rustle of my rays through leaves, yet stronger than the winds across mountains. "How can this be?" she said, and in that question, all of Israel spoke. All of creation leaned in. The angel answered, not with reason, but with revelation. "The Holy Spirit will come upon you." I saw the words leave his lips like flame cloaked in silence. They did not burn. They built, not a fire, but a future. He named the child not as idea, but as certainty. Jesus. and the name shimmered in the air between them like a key waiting for a door. I felt the world pause, not just the room, but the soil, the rivers, the sky. As if everything made had turned toward this small corner of Nazareth and waited. Angels do not falter. Gabriel did not falter, but even he seemed to still his wings as her breath caught in her chest. And then she answered. She did not raise her voice. She did not lift her hand. She simply opened. "Behold, the handmaid of the Lord," she said, and her voice was both whisper and wind, seed and soil. "Let it be done to me according to your word." The words were not echoed, they were absorbed. The moment did not explode, it deepened. And in that deepening, I saw at conception not just of child, but of covenant. Light does not weep. But I came close, for I had shone over temples and kings and prophets, but never had I seen the divine choose such humility. I remained still, pouring myself over every corner of the room, holding space like arms that cannot touch but can shelter. Gabriel withdrew, not abruptly, not in vanishing, but in completion. He did not rise, he simply ceased to be here, because his purpose had been fulfilled. But the weight of his words lingered like fragrance in fabric, and I stayed with her. She did not fall to her knees, she did not sing. She simply sat. One hand rested on her belly, though nothing had yet changed. And yet, everything had. She was no longer waiting, she was becoming. I shone upon her face as she looked to the window, not outward but inward. I did not ask to stay, but I remained as long as I could, because something inside me knew I had witnessed the turning of the world, and not even light comes away from such a moment unchanged. The village outside bustled now. Laughter, footsteps, bread baking. But within these walls, time still bent. I knew others would come. Joseph, Elizabeth, shepherds, stars, but none would see what I had seen. The moment the word became flesh, not in thunder, but in trust, not with spectacle, but with surrender. I was not the miracle, but I had touched it. And in the quiet morning, as I finally began to rise away, I whispered the only thing light can say to such mystery, not in words, but in radiance. I am here. I was with you, and I will shine again, not to remind you of what happened, but to remind you of who you are now. For in this room, eternity found a home, and I, the morning light, was allowed to behold it. I stepped gently from the room where eternity had whispered itself into time. I did not rush. I did not blaze. I withdrew like breath leaving a prayer, like incense fading into the rafters of a temple. The house behind me remained quiet, unchanged to the eye, yet every particle of it shimmered with a new weight. I moved across the threshold and down the narrow path, tracing familiar stones, but they felt different beneath me. The earth, though silent, pulsed, not loudly, not in tremors, but in reverence. The village had begun its ordinary rhythms. A boy chased a chicken through dust. A woman poured water from a jug into a basin, humming a song without melody. A man leaned into his plow, coaxing his mule with soft curses. They saw me, but not truly. I warmed their skin, cast their shadows, danced across their rooftops, but they did not know what I had just seen. And yet, something in them paused, only for a breath. A hesitation in the hand, a flicker in the eye, then gone. But I noticed, because I was looking for it. The fig tree outside the widow's home shimmered. Its leaves, still heavy with dew, caught me differently, as if they were bowing. A bee hovered over a flower and stayed longer than usual, wings quiet. A stray dog paused in mid-step, nose lifted, not to sniff, but to sense. These were not miracles, these were recognitions. The world, though not speaking, was responding. I slipped between the wooden beams of a stable. A young calf blinked at me, then turned its head toward a patch of sunlight on the wall, nostrils flaring. Not fear, not instinct, reverence. I brushed against the well at the center of town. An old man drew water, and when a single drop splashed onto his hand, he paused. Not from cold, not from distraction. Something in that touch reminded him of what he did not know. But he looked up, not at me, beyond me, then shook his head and moved on, but his gait had slowed. His breath deepened. I followed the water down its path through the gutters and into the soil, and I watched as the roots beneath drank more eagerly than before. The almond tree by the eastern edge of the field lifted its limbs not just in light, but in longing. I passed over it slowly, leaving traces of gold in its creases, and felt its whole being lean towards something it could not name. I crossed paths with a girl carrying firewood. One of the smaller branches fell, and she bent to pick it up. For a moment, she stared at it not because it was unusual, but because something in its grain seemed familiar. She held it longer than needed, then tucked it gently into her bundle. I made my way along the olive grove, touching each tree like a priest anoints foreheads. They did not bloom early, they did not speak, but they stood differently, as if aware they were witnesses. The wind rejoined me, moving softly between branches. It did not play this time. It carried something, not message, memory. We swirled together down the hill, toward the stream. There, a woman washed linens against the stones. I bathed the cloths in warmth, and for a moment, her fingers stopped moving. She closed her eyes. A second later, she resumed. But her breathing had changed. The stream caught me fully now, light breaking on water like laughter held just beneath the surface. Fish stirred, then stilled. A dragonfly hovered, then landed on a reed. The air buzzed, not with noise, but with tension made holy. I hovered above the current, and for one suspended second, I felt it again, the echo of what had just happened. The word had taken root, not in temple or throne, but in a girl's womb, in a town that would not be named in the scrolls of Rome. And yet the stones knew, the trees listened. The insects paused mid-flight. Even the dust I lifted as I passed seemed to hang longer in the air, as though reluctant to settle. I reached the outer edge of the village, where the shepherds sometimes rested. Empty now, just stones and grass, and a single broken sandal someone had forgotten. I touched it. Even that worn leather, cracked and frayed, seemed to hold its breath, because everything made remembers, not always in mind, but in being. As I rose further, stretching over rooftops and hills, I looked back not with eyes, but with essence. The house where she sat no longer shimmered with anything visible. To those who passed, it was just another home. But to me, it had become axis, the turning point, not of the sun, of history. I had seen nations rise with trumpets and fall in silence, but this came with neither. Only a yes, only a womb, and yet all creation knew, even if not consciously. It bent subtly, reverently, as I passed. Children laughed in the streets now, kicking stones and chasing one another. I lit their faces. They did not stop to wonder why they smiled so easily, but their joy rang with resonance. I felt it in the leaves. I felt it in the soil. I felt it in myself, and I knew. I had not just witnessed light entering the world, I had witnessed light becoming flesh. And now, I returned to my place in the sky, not higher, but deeper. For though I still shone, I carried something I had not before. Not just morning, not just light, but memory of the beginning again. I stretched beyond Nazareth, across fields and valleys, not because I was commanded, but because light cannot remain still. It is in my nature to move, to touch, to reach, but something in me had shifted. I no longer scattered myself with the aimless joy of morning. I moved with intention, with memory, with reverence. What I had witnessed did not stay behind, mate traveled with me, reshaping how I touched the world. I poured myself over the hills of Galilee, over shepherds unaware, merchants already shouting prices, children still yawning. There were homes where shutters stayed closed long after sunrise, where curtains hung heavy with grief or fear or shame. I did not skip them. I slipped through cracks, under doors, through holes in roofs. I did not ask to be welcomed. I simply arrived, and where I could, I lingered, on dusty floorboards, on withered faces, on hands curled in sleep or fists. Some stirred, some turned away, some blinked and wept without knowing why. I did not judge, I did not choose. I was given, not earned, and so I gave myself to all. In one alley, I found a woman clutching a bundle of cloth, whispering a name I could not hear. Her back was against the wall, her eyes toward the ground. She did not see me, but I touched her brow. and she exhaled not relief, but release, a soft sound, almost a lullaby. In that breath, I felt something let go, a grief, a memory, or maybe a prayer. I moved on, tracing her shadow as if to carry it for a while. There was a man who stared into an empty cup, his shop not yet opened. He looked at nothing, and still I touched the table before him. When he reached for his cup, his hand trembled. He sipped. He sat straighter. He did not smile, but he stayed. Further down, in a house with 7 steps, a child lay in bed with fever. His mother paced. I lit her steps. I warmed the basin in her hands. When she pressed the cloth to his forehead, I joined her touch. He did not wake, but he sighed, and she smiled, just briefly, as if remembering something she'd forgotten she knew. I reached the outskirts of a town where lepers had gathered in caves. I did not recoil. I entered. I spilled myself across stone and skin, and though they turned from the sting of light, I stayed. I traced the ridges of their faces, the silence of their wounds. Not to heal, to witness, to say, "You are not forgotten." Light does not discriminate. It arrives, it beholds, it abides. I traveled next through fields where farmers had risen early. Their hands were calloused, their backs bent, their voices already coarse from calling oxen. They did not notice me, not in the way poets imagine, but their crops did. The grain tilted toward me, the vines twisted slightly. Creation, even when unseen, still reaches. I found a fisherman mending nets by the sea. His fingers were swift, his mind elsewhere. I lit his work, strand by strand. He paused once, looked up at the sky, and for no reason he understood, smiled. That was enough. I moved across boats, across water, across waves. The sea held me gently, rocking my reflection like lullaby. There was a storm forming far beyond the horizon, but I did not fear it. Light knows storms. Light knows they pass. I reached a city where stone walls loomed and beggars lined the gates. I did not stop for the strong. I touched the overlooked. I found a blind man begging beside the temple steps. He could not see me, but he turned his face upward when I touched his shoulder. His mouth moved without voice. A prayer, perhaps, or thanks, or nothing. I did not need to know. I rested there a moment longer. Even when unseen, light sees. I passed over a courtyard where children chased each other with sticks and laughter. One fell, the others kept running. He sat alone, brushing dust from his knee. I warmed his skin. He looked up, not at the others, at me, or perhaps through me. His laughter returned. I moved on. There was a widow folding linens in a house with cracked windows. She hummed, not with joy, but habit. I entered quietly, cast my glow over her fingers. She paused, just once, then folded slower, more carefully, as if her task had taken on weight, or meaning, or maybe memory. I do not give answers. I do not fix, but I show up, and sometimes showing up is what makes things bearable. I kept moving, through doorways and gardens and cisterns and ruins. I touched coins and crumbs, sandals and staffs, tears and song. I did not stay long in any one place, but I never left without leaving something behind, not seen, not named, but felt. A hush, a warmth, a reminder. That light had been where no one thought to look, and still I traveled. I passed through caves where prophets once hid, over rivers where sandals once stepped. I touched olive presses and market stalls, bakeries and tombs. I lit the blade of a knife, paused above bread. I slipped into the silence between verses of prayer. I did not shine brighter in holy places, nor dimmer in broken ones. I was the same, but what I carried had changed. I no longer only announced mourning. I carried memory. I carried witness. I carried the echo of her yes. And though none who received me knew, I knew. I knew I would dim soon. Mourning cannot stay forever. But before I faded, I turned once more toward the house where it all began. I did not go back. I simply acknowledged. I bowed. And then I rose, not in distance, but in awe, because the world had not changed its appearance. But everything beneath it had begun again. The day neared its close, and Beyonce bowled across rooftops and valleys began to draw myself in. Not because I was weary, for light does not tire, but because even radiance must make room for rest. I had traveled far since that first shimmer through her window. I had poured myself across cities in silence, across laughter and grief. I had touched faces that would never remember me, stirred hearts that would never name me. And yet, something in me had changed. I was not the source, I was not the word, but I had been chosen to be near it, to herald it, to hold space around it like cupped hands around a flame. I had always believed my task was simple: to rise, to shine, to fade, a rhythm older than stone, predictable as breath. But today had taught me otherwise. Today, I had been allowed not just to witness, but to belong. I had touched the edge of eternity clothed in flesh, and though I could not hold it, I carried its imprint. I moved now slower, softer, draping myself over hills like a blanket, not to conceal but to comfort. Shadows stretched long, colors deepened, the world exhaled. I had always loved this time, the hush before the stars. But tonight, that hush felt different, not a closing, a consecration. Somewhere, a boy chased the last of the sunlight across a field, his laughter echoing. Somewhere else, a widow lit a lamp, unaware that her quiet act mirrored something ancient and holy. In the mountains, goats returned to their pens, unaware that the dust on their backs had borne witness to glory. I saw it all, and for the first time, I wondered if that was enough: to see, to bear witness, to carry light not as a spotlight, but as a sacrament, not to explain, but to accompany. I passed over rooftops now cloaked in evening, and still I remembered. I remembered her eyes, the way they had not widened in fear, but opened in welcome. I remembered the silence after her, yes, fuller than any song I had ever lit. I remembered Gabriel's stillness, the gravity in his words, the absence of spectacle, and I asked myself not aloud, for I have no mouth, was I enough? Was my presence, my glow, my hush? Was it worthy of the moment it had surrounded? Could light alone prepare the world for the mystery it cannot contain? I did not know. I do not know. But I returned to the sky, as I always do, not as ending, but as offering. I stretched thin across the horizon, bleeding gold into blue, amber into indigo, and I whispered, not to the world, but to the one who had sent me, let it be enough. Let this day, this light, this witness, let it be part of the unfolding. I watched as lamps were lit, one by one, not in fear of dark, but in trust of its purpose. Night does not erase, it reveals, and even there, I knew I would return reflected in stars, remembered in embers, remembered in story. There is a loneliness to light that few understand. We arrive, we touch, we leave. We do not linger, we do not claim, we do not possess. And yet, in every place I went today, I left something behind, not to be seen, but to be felt. A warmth, a pause, a shimmer that says, something holy passed through here, not loudly, not famously, but truly. And that, I think, is how the kingdom comes, not with trumpet, but with tenderness, not through conquest, but through consent. I drifted now above the sea, the waves sighing like old prayers. I hovered over a vineyard, its leaves curled with the last light. I brushed a temple wall, its stones warm with memory. I traced the silhouette of a man walking home, his thoughts too loud for speech. I do not know what they carried, these places, these people, but I know this: the one now growing in her womb will touch them all, not as I did with light, but with skin, with hunger, with laughter, with pain. And somehow, I, who cannot be held, felt held by that hope, that the God who made me would one day walk beneath me, not in glory, but in sandals. I reached the edge of the desert, where nothing stirred but the wind. I paused there, just for a breath, a single breath that stretched beyond time, and I saw not with sight, but with knowing that this story was only beginning, that what I had witnessed would ripple across generations, across hearts and altars and graves, that somewhere, someday, someone would remember the light that lingered a little longer that morning, and maybe they would look at the world differently, not as ordinary, but as potential, that a field might hold eternity, that a girl's yes might hold salvation. That light, unnoticed, might still be holy. I faded now, not with regret, but with gratitude. I had been allowed to see, to shine, to share, and though no one would write of me, though no name would mark my passing, I was there, and I remember. So if ever you find yourself bathed in morning stillness, if you catch a golden glimmer on the floor and pause without knowing why, perhaps it is me. Perhaps it is the memory I left behind, and perhaps, if you are quiet enough, you will hear what I heard not with ears, but with soul. That hush before Loy became Thunzak, that silence that sang eternity, that light which said not look at me, but behold him. And in that moment, you too may say yes, not because you must, but because you can. And in that yes, may the world begin again, not in thunder, not in fear, but in light, always in light.